I've just put up the antitrust policy notice as usual. So that should be running in the background. Give me a second. Okay. I see Mark has joined. Mark, I just said hi to everyone and said probably wait a couple of minutes, see who joins. So I'll just hand over to you.
Okay. Do you want me to start sharing my screen?
Sure, I'll just cancel my share. There we go. So over to you.
Okay. Give it to 9:04, and then we can start. Oh, there we are, 9:04. Okay. So last week, or I should say last week, last meeting, we discussed some of the changes that were discussed in the previous meeting, which is this session. So there's a second of the month and there's a fourth week of the month meeting. And so last time this session met, the second meeting of the month was obviously in the second week of August. We discussed some major format changes based on some of the feedback we've gotten. And that's where I want to touch on that a little bit and then continue on with our discussion around one other piece of feedback that we have, and then talk about the possibility of entertaining a additional optional section inside the spec, which would be potentially around security, vulnerability with respect to open source. Okay, so it's always helpful to update where we think the current objectives are, and they're slightly evolving. And we did discuss last meeting to accept this potential restructuring of the flow of the document. It was also recommended that we not necessarily put a time frame on it of like say 18 to 24 months, but let's just get the ISO version out there and let's start seeing how people adopt it. And if we find the need is 12 months out or 36 months out, we'll feel it. We'll take, we'll get the feedback and make a decision according to that. So that is actually somewhat of a change, and I just want to make sure people are aware of that. And one of the reasons is, people are going to, start to come and try to adopt the ISO version, and they're going to be concerned if we have this, shorter runway with this spec that it might change underneath them. We are also continuing to focus on obtaining feedback from those who are already conforming and those who are struggling to conform. I always like to highlight that the ultimate goal right now is, this is the main focus is to build trust around open source. And we really want to represent the quality, the requirements for what a quality compliance program would include. Finally, the point I mentioned a little earlier is the chance to discuss adding or extending the spec to include an optional section, not a required section, around security vulnerability, which I do want to spend some time today to start that discussion and again, it's more of an exploratory discussion. There's no commitment to even do it, but just to get a sense of whether that makes sense or not. And that's going to take several months before we get a true sense of our community and where we're at with that. I always like to highlight that there are some important links or resources for this this effort. I'll just move on. You can see that in the video if you're interested to go review that. One thing I always like to do in every meeting is take a chance, pause and have the opportunity for people to submit some additional feedback they've been thinking about with respect to the spec. Is there any particular topics other than the ones we have listed on the issues list that people are interested in raising here at today's meeting? Okay. So there's no new topics to include. The one thing that did also come out of last week's meeting or last time was the need for potentially a FAQ dedicated to helping people understand how this version of the spec is different than the 2.1 version or the ISO version. And I attempted to put a few questions out there that we might include on that FAQ because we're expecting some significant changes and we want to make sure that it's really clear or provides additional a place to obtain additional clarification around those concerns that people might have. So here are some questions that I put out for initial consideration. Are there others that people might want to include in this FAQ list? Excuse me? Did someone have a comment?
Someone unmuted but remuted again. I'm not sure who it was. Just to let you know, if you do have a comment, you are currently muted. So we need you to unmute.
Okay. I mean, this is just the beginning of this task of creating this list, but you know, we'll definitely be adding over time. There'll be plenty of opportunities to add to it. Okay, so last time this group met, or I would say the 9 o'clock, I'll call it the 9 o'clock versus the 5 o'clock meeting. There was you know, an emphasis put on, you know, updating this definition of what a program is. And we discussed it at the 5 o'clock meeting last time. And I think there was general agreement that this makes a lot of sense. So let me see if I can pull up the spec here. So we'll have to, here, is this it? Yeah. So what that looks like in the context of the spec is as following, that this additional wording would be put in right here. So it's making reference to, you know, someone has a program and that program is defined by the scope in whatever section this will end up being. This section is the actual scope section, which we're going to discuss next, was also discussed in the last 2 meetings about possibly moving it. And I think there's general agreement that makes sense. So we don't know the exact location yet. One other edit that I did go ahead and suggest is to remove the word license. Now, it is true that we are very focused on license compliance, but there's an opportunity for us to slightly broaden our scope around open source compliance and activities in general. And this would give a little bit more flexibility. Let me pause for a second and see what people think about that edit right here. I know that licensing is at the core of what we do, but there are chances for us to broaden our mission. So any thoughts about possibly removing the word license?
I just want to jump in and say, because this is sort of an open blank slate for discussion, I think it's fine to noodle on this because we've had all kinds of requests come in over the years. We just have to keep reiterating that there's no, how to put it, there's no imperative to expand our compliance spec into a new area, but we are here chatting through these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
Right,
and I
so
think,
that would be my question.
Mhm.
What other kinds of open source compliance would there be other than license?
well, people might have needs around security or export. Now that would mean that you're dealing with compliance with respect to your open source, with respect to different topics, right?
Yeah, but are we do we plan to deal with those kinds of things?
We're beginning to discuss the opportunity, but let's ask one question. If we remove the word license, does that weaken the spec, or does that make it less clear?
I mean, I just want to go on the background here. The interesting thing, Mary, has just been that people keep asking us, can we cover export control? Can we cover security? And I guess what we're doing here is we're just trying to think through how we respond to them. And that could be adding interaction with another spec entirely rather than OpenChain. It's really an open discussion. It's just that we keep getting asked these questions, so we just need to talk through it. To see where we go. Mark, just on the license compliance thing, I think we get a lot of questions in if we remove license from compliance because it takes away the narrow scope. But it's a dialogue that I think regardless we need to have
Yeah.
these calls with the wider community.
So,
Well, I think if we take out license, then that opens it up for those other things which we're not really dealing with.
well,
So leave that kind of a
Mhm.
question on the table, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we could very well say that, we're not ready to take it out yet. And, just leave it in there. And I do want to start to have that discussion possibly today about what that means. One of the core concepts that I think about when I think about OpenChain, and particularly this spec, is that it's all about creating trust around the use of open source. It's a very, it's a slightly bigger scope of what it could potentially be, right? And clearly, in order to get trust or comfort around open source, you want to make sure the software you're receiving and any open source that's included inside it, that the person delivering that to you is being they're compliant with all the licensing. That's foundational,
Right.
and that will always be core to the spec. But then there's opportunities to say, when you deliver me that software, I want to trust that you've met certain requirements around, or certain disciplines. You have a certain discipline around security, vulnerability management, right? Because that's one of the hotter areas right now that we're seeing people raising concerns in our contracts with respect to open source. In fact, went through an audit a couple of months ago, and I was surprised that I was in that meeting with the larger customer to talk about how we handle open source. And, here we are conforming with the spec, and quite a few questions came up too, but how do you give us assurance around your managing the vulnerabilities that end up in the open source you're grabbing? That's more the spirit of what I was thinking. I'm sorry, do you have any comments?
Hi, this is Marcel from PwC. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on this one. So I think it would make sense to remove the word license if we come up with other recommendations which they should be compliant against. So, I mean, just remove the word license and then leave it open, I think doesn't make so much sense. But going forward, as you say, security is a very important topic. And if we want to include this, but then we should also, of course, consider, okay, but what exactly then they should be compliant against, yeah? So either we then come up with a content for security management in open source, or we can refer to another source where compliance measurements for open source security are already stated and defined, or something. I think that's something then we need to tackle and think about.
And just to reiterate here, and this is just up for the record and so on, if people are reviewing the call, we're not talking about the ISO spec here. We're talking about what comes later. And the ISO spec will be in play. It's going to be in play for a decade. and there might be a new spec, there might be supplementary updates, but what we're talking about today is not what's going to happen to you in the ISO release later this month or in October. But talking through this gets us ready to address this question, which we haven't really done yet. And it's also part of the material that we're preparing, so post-ISO, when people come in to see how we develop the spec and so on, they can look at these recordings and then they can jump on future calls and talk through. Sorry, Marcel, I thought your points were important and useful. I just wanted to put this in here so people who are new wouldn't, especially people listening to the recording, wouldn't misunderstand that we're going to change the ISO spec underneath their feet.
Yeah, and what it might be helpful to do is create a second document, right, for optional things, meaning let's not maybe force those additional options into this one document and keep it more pure. That's a possibility. And so I think as we move forward and discuss this opportunity to include other kinds of trust factors such as security and export, I think that's probably a better thing to do, keep it outside. And then if at some point in time people feel like, oh, it should be somehow brought together again. This also partially comes from, I think, this other topic we have, section, I'm going to go all the way to the end. It's about the engagement with the community, right? So section 5. Oh, sorry. Where we are, right? I'm sorry, where's section 5? Or it should be right here. Yeah. Oh, here it is. Okay. Understanding the open source community engagements. And this is in some ways a little different than license compliance. Okay. Not exactly completely separate, right? There's clearly a need to be complying with licenses when you're contributing to community, but this was more put in to say, well, if you're going to engage with the community, you have some discipline around that engagement. And this was always a kind of a topic that was kind of secondary to the rest of the spec. Still very important to people who are handling, dealing with license compliance. They're often the next natural step is when a company matures is to go from bringing in open source to contributing it out. And so in some ways, I think this section could be potentially one of those optional sections in the future. I'm not saying it should for sure, but that's just to show you that the spec one, this was an attempt to expand the spec a little bit beyond license compliance. Any thoughts about that?
Just jumping in, again, that kind of hits on a topic where people keep saying to us, how do we frame that more? So it's also an ongoing to-do discussion item, has been for a while.
Yes, that is correct. This has always been one of these topics. Go ahead, yes.
Sorry, I think it depends from which angle you look onto this topic. Because actually, when you do contributions, of course, you also need to consider license compliance for your own contributions and to the projects you contribute to. And particularly when you set up your own project, you also need to consider quite a lot around compliance with internal regulations, but also license compliance for this project, etc. So to be honest, the verification materials which are requested there for this particular topic right now don't go so much into this direction, but this could be also a consideration if we want to give this additional flavor to this section, that for contributions and community management, license compliance or compliance is also, of course, a relevant topic.
And just adjacent to that, about 10 years ago, one of the very large multinationals involved in open source actually had a slightly weird policy where their contributors contributed under personal addresses, which made it really hard to track what they were doing. But externally, it was just a little bit challenging. But even internally for the company, how do they monitor what their open source is and how it's going? So having engagement framed in a more explicit way over time might be beneficial to prevent that type of long-term governance challenge that will inevitably emerge.
And one of the other real drivers for this section, if I recall, was we were getting some feedback from some foundations when we were, socializing the spec, and they felt that we should have some element in the spec that would help make sure companies become more disciplined when they're contributing and to encourage contributions. And again, license compliance is critical to that exercise, but the actual intent or the goal or objective was a little broader at the time for including it. And at the same time, a lot of people feel like this is, like it was just mentioned, it's a little thin and we probably need to expand it, but it gets really challenging because then this expansion of it tends to get beyond license compliance. And I'm just, yeah, go ahead.
And of course, we want to have that balance between, if people want to go down the route of contribution, that they can do so, but not to suggest they have to. It's just that they have to have a way to frame yes or no and how that happens.
Right, and the question then comes, is raised is what should be our role in helping companies be better at that, right? If they do have it, they have the ability, like, okay, so Shane points out that you're not required. In fact, this is worded that way. It's worded saying, if you happen to be contributing, right? You're not expected to or required to in order to conform with the spec. But if you happen to do it, it's an option in a way, then we want to make sure that you have some kind of discipline and there's some trust there, right? So it always comes back to that. What role should we play in helping the world become more trusting around open source, in this case, on contributions? Okay, so
I would like to expand on the point of being optional. I like the idea of adding best practices onto the standard that are optional, but I do see the issue that that's pretty hard to actually get conformant to, or it gets weird to some degree. At one point, you will have companies that are OpenChain conformant, except for security and community, although community basically just said there is a policy, and I like to quote Shane on the smallest policy, that is nope. I believe that most of the things that we address here, and even the optional ones, including security, they are at some point addressed or can be addressed in very short things. So I would like to raise the question if it is actually worth flagging things optional when they are in fact somewhat minor in their extent.
So if they're minor in their extent, they shouldn't be optional, is what you're proposing?
Yes, for instance, the contribution policy. I see little reason to make it optional, mostly because I consider this weakening to the whole standard, because it will have different flavors depending on the implementation, really. And all that we really ask here is that the company looked at it, right? It made a policy that states how it is done. It barely dictates to what extent its contributions need to be monitored.
I think your observation is correct. It is very weak, and I'm not sure it achieves a great deal with, but it was partly included because we want to have a good relationship with the open source community at large, and they felt that this is something that we should consider. Now, but to your point, it is also it is kind of optional in how it's written, right? It's saying if you happen to contribute or have a policy, right? So this, in theory, theoretically, it's kind of an option. as it's written. And the question really is, I'm not really even going to recommend that we take this one out because it's so closely related to the rest of the spec, right? But it does begin to suggest that, you know, options aren't necessarily interesting. Now, by having things optional, you don't want to have them in any way blur or confuse people with respect to the core of the spec. So that's why I think some things can be optional. In other words, you must be OpenChain conforming before you even can move on to an optional piece. But if you are OpenChain conforming, you get that badge. And if you happen to satisfy the requirements of an optional section, such as security or export, then you'll get a second badge. But you can't get the second badge unless you have the first badge, right? But you always have to get the first badge no matter what, which is what the spec stands for today. And
that seems to get very complex to me.
Okay.
I would prefer we de-optionalize things, but give a way to say, for example, you have to state how you want to contribute to open source projects, if at all, but it should be stated in the policy that we are not going to contribute back to open source projects. Therefore, don't pick something that requires contribution back. You know, some better wording than that, obviously, but you know, I don't think these are minor things. Export is not a minor thing. Security is not a minor thing. I think somehow those should get addressed. If we're going to address those kinds of things, we should address all of them in some way, shape, or form.
Okay, and so are you suggesting that should we choose to address a particular topic, additional topic, that it should not be an option?
Right. You can phrase it in such a way that, you know, you have to somehow address it, at least in your policy. Even if you're going to say we are not going to address it, your policy has to state that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So then now you specifically addressed it in some way, even if your address is that you're not going to address.
Okay. Any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair option and opinion. And, you know, to Mary's point, I think ultimately our current community thing is, if not half-baked, then a half-completed compromise concept, right? That we want to make sure that open source foundations are satisfied that contribution is included, but we don't want to be prescriptive about it. And to some extent, we put the nuance of that on the shelf and said, we'll come back later. So, I think Mary's point that we might want to expand on it more explicitly may be a way to properly close that loop.
Okay, so let's continue on with the other feedback review, and then let's conclude this meeting by discussing, I think, the possibility for a security extension. I'll keep it as an extension for now, which could be potentially optional. Okay. So the other piece of feedback that we received that was pretty material, I thought, was this idea of rearranging the spec so that the scope would come first and then the policy and then awareness. And there was an additional thought where the competence section would be moved into another one. But yet these three, although they're kind of already in the same foundational section, we just rearranged them a little bit because of the program scope has a particularly important role to define exactly what is the program you're covering, right? And everything else follows from that. So if I go back to the spec, what I did was at the last 5 p.m. meeting, I actually tried to rearrange the spec to see what it might look like. But the feedback I got was maybe it would be better just to mark the current one up with comments. And so I went back and I did that. So instead of moving things around, people see where they are and put a comment in there to suggest where they might go. Okay. So this section here is actually, these are two items that come together. And the reason why competence and awareness were put together is because that's how I saw it in the ISO 9001 2015 spec. And the goal would be to take, I'm looking for the program. Hold on a second here. We got to, so I thought I marked it up here. Yeah, I guess it's down below. Second one. So this section over here, program scope, it's already in this section. I think the best thing for me to do is go right to the table of contents, because I know not everybody's versed in this spec. And what we did, we've broken the spec out into these core sections: program foundation, relevant tasks and defined and supported, right? The open source content review and approval processes. And then there's this main one about compliance artifact creation and delivery. And here we discussed just a second ago, the understanding of open source community engagements and adherence to the spec overall. Those are the core pillars of this spec, right? So within this section, we have something called program scope. And the idea would be just to move it up to above policy, because that's where we get to define the scope, and then that everything else follows from that. And that doesn't really change semantically the spec, but it seemed like a good idea. And it was generally agreed on last meeting that that would be a good idea. And again, I like to bring these up several times to give people an opportunity to comment on these changes before we even, attempt to make that change in the spec. So let me go back down to the section where program scope is. It's right here. And you shouldn't confuse it with this other red section above. This section would move, okay? And this other section was the other one, which is competence and awareness. These two was agreed upon last time to keep them together, okay? And the reason why is because, again, in another ISO standard, 9001, they are together. Whether we keep them in the foundational section, this one, or we move it to relevant tasks defined and supported, is to be discussed further. And that's the that was the feedback that was raised at the meeting we held at the 9 a.m. meeting 1 month ago. So do people have any thoughts about whether the whole section should be moved, or whether it should stay in the foundation? And again, this is largely around training, and this is around awareness of your policies and objectives and so forth.
I'm kind of in favor of not expecting to change it, but doing a version of it with it moved and just saying to people, hey, have a look, what do you think of that? Because our broader audience might not have a good mental model unless they actually see it.
Sure. So you're recommending just draft it up and see what people think. Just do the move and see what people think.
I mean,
okay.
As long as people understand this isn't us iterating on the ISO standard, as long as we keep saying that and making sure people don't freak out, I think that being creative here is the right thing to do. Giving people a chance to really repolish this and say, this could be a future direction. We should be brave on that.
Okay. And I definitely want to emphasize that this does not change the semantics of the spec compared to the ISO version. It would only be a more logical placement of things. Okay, and the other thing that was, go ahead, yes, comments?
I had a question on, you said you're going to put program scope above policy.
Yes, so this down here, this section here, would simply move up to be occur right before policy, ahead of policy.
I guess in my mind, policy is the first thing. Once you have a policy, then everything else kind of falls as a consequence of the policy.
The initial recommendation that we got was that the program scope defines the program itself. You know, so every organization can describe their program with respect to, it could be the entire company, it could be a particular division within their company, it could be a specific product line that they apply the program to. So we give them that degree of flexibility. So the idea would be to have them define that, what it is, the thing itself up front, and then talk about the policy of it and everything else around. So the, you know, in some ways the policy is not going away, right? It's definitely a core piece of it, and it doesn't semantically change it. The idea would be define what we're, you know, the program itself up front, and then everything else follows from that. So do you believe if we move the program up, the program scope, do you believe that it would have a negative impact on?
Okay, so, but you're thinking that the policy then is the policy for that program scope.
Correct.
Rather than like a complete organizational policy.
That is
Very
correct.
high level. Okay. Then
Yeah.
that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think your view is a natural place to go, right? Everybody's thinking that their companies have policies and they generally tend to be pretty broad, right? And that could very well be the case, right? Someone can have a company-wide policy for open source, and that, you know, they just would have their program scope defined as the entire company. Okay. So that was something I think will likely stick, but we're going to keep it out there for a little longer. And the other comment that we got was to include the word objectives in this particular requirement within the program scope. I should have included this verification materials section with the scope. I should have highlighted it. But so I think we did discuss that. Mary, I think you might have been here for that. We discussed objectives. And in fact, that came from the awareness section, I believe. I'm sorry. We talk about relevant open source objectives here, and it was raised by Marcel and his team that that we don't make any reference to it at all, other than we make a reference here. And it was just thought that, well, why don't we have them include that in their program scope definition, you know, as part of defining their scope. And I think that I'm going to let it sit a little longer, but I think that that kind of makes sense. Anybody?
Okay.
Yeah. And again, we like to, you know, let things sit there for a while because we want a lot of eyes to, you know, to get a glimpse of it so that we can make sure that we're getting a broad enough set of feedback. And I'll be posting this to the mailing list as well. Mm-hmm.
I'd just like to add here that objectives is mentioned once in the introduction, where it is basically stating the objectives of the specification. And because of that, we have two objectives that might refer to different things. Hence, it is, I see it more important to actually define it here.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Are we going to create an example
of what objectives might be?
Specifically, yeah, because that's the topic we're on, but you know, it's also kind of a general thing, or share some examples of open source compliant programs and how they fulfill those different areas.
So I think that would be a good thing to have. I think if you want, we could even possibly include that in the FAQ. What might be a good example of an objectives. The one thing we don't want to do is put examples into the spec. And in some sense, it's kept a little bit more generic, right? So we're not too prescriptive, the spec itself. But one of the nice compliments is for someone to write like a best practices kind of document or presentation, and they can actually say, well, we consider these to be objectives. And I think what we can do is we can include examples in the FAQ I talked about a little earlier in the meeting.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Okay, any other thoughts? Okay. Let me see if we talked about that. I'm gonna go. All right, let me go back to one other section. There was one other comment on the website. Actually, before we do that, we don't have a lot of time left. Let me come back to that original discussion where I was highlighting this possibility of this. I want to go a little further on the possibilities of an exploratory security vulnerability section, and I want to be careful not to use the word optional anymore. But or are there others? Well, the goal here for this last item, I want to start the discussion to get people's feedback on whether it's really meaningful or relevant. So we kind of touched on it quite a bit already, but the idea would be, in order to help our end users, right, with the supply chain trusting each other, how many people here deal with having to address concerns around security vulnerabilities or believe their organization might be interested in seeing that kind of additional set of guidance with respect to receiving software from another company and being able to trust them with respect to security?
I'm raising my hand. We've been dealing with
I'm
this
sorry?
for a couple of years. We've been dealing with this for
Okay.
a couple of years, so I am raising my hand to say, yes, we're doing
Okay.
this.
Now, are you at all involved in this part of the review process when you're receiving software from another supplier, or even within one's company, right? When developers are developing stuff in there, either you can go receive software from like a commercial vendor, or you can grab open source, right? And either way, I think there's that challenge. Are you involved in that process at all?
Yes.
Okay.
Not in executing and examining the security vulnerabilities, but the fact of having such a policy and knowing that it is or is not being executed. So at this point, we're mostly doing it in software that we're sending out to our customers. We should also be doing it, and thank you for the reminder, doing it on software that's coming in from vendors that we are then using in software that we're sending out to customers. I don't think we have a good process around that.
Okay.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, Mark, I was just going to say, we have a slightly different approach. The security vulnerabilities are not looked at by neither the third-party IP team, which is my team, which looks after all the license compliance aspects when we bring in IP from outside of ARM. But the security is looked at by the individual products group, because they look at the security vulnerabilities for the product as a whole, rather than just the individual components. So for example, if we develop our own software and then sort of combine that with third-party IP, they look at the total vulnerability for the software that they're producing, regardless of whether it is ARM IP or whether it's third-party IP. It's a slightly different approach, and the sort of policies and processes are governed by a different set of people.
Yeah, I can
Sure.
second that. It's Katharina here. I have a different, sorry, I have the same view as Sami, that it's kind of a different approach when I work with my customers. So usually it's a different team, and I would even add that it's, you know, the respective product team. There's one exception, and that's the automotive industry. So I see that in the automotive industry, because of the ISO, what is it, 2626262, we see a lot of overlap. So the product teams working more closely together, especially because when I tell them that OpenChain is also becoming an ISO standard, so they are both like, okay, we have now 2 ISO standards, they are somehow closely related. What can we do to work more closely together? So yes, I would also say that it would be good to start thinking about how we can connect the dots here.
I mean, my approach would be to define, you know, rather than sort of add it as an option, is to define what is needed. So I would prefer to keep it as a separate activity, and once it's established, to sort of say, can we now combine this sort of as a key requirement or as an optional requirement into the specification.
Yeah.
So because again, I would prefer to build knowledge and establish what, you know, what we see as a good security policy and process, and then say, does it really fit to combine it? Or probably my gut feeling is that it would be likely that yes, it would be, and it would make sense to add it. But I would like to explore what are the components, what do we need to do, and define that, and then sort of worry about where does it sit, where does it fit.
Yeah. I mean, there's
So,
one
Sami,
very obvious common denominator, and that is both teams, the license compliance team from the open source perspective and the security guys, need to know what is in the software, who is responsible, and where is it documented, right? So
Right.
it's down to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So to your point, Catalina, one of the most important things I think the spec does is it says you create a bill of materials, an open source bill of materials. Let me be clear about that. And that is so core to, you know, compliance of the licenses, but it's also very core to security vulnerability management. Meaning, and again, I'm only talking about the open source parts. Now, Sami, you referred to, you know, you have a broader scope, and I think a lot of companies would, right? That it's about security, their entire product, even the code they write.
Yeah.
But what I find is there's a lot of effort and work going on in the world, and we all, you know, see it, where there's a lot of tracking of security vulnerabilities with respect to open source components, right? And what I would recommend is, obviously, we stay focused on the open source part. And again, it's about creating trust with respect to the open source you're receiving. And it's really, can I trust that you've been disciplined enough to at least have a process in place to look at security vulnerabilities and to be able to respond to them if problems occur, right? So I think the thing I want to highlight is that we would not be a broader, obviously a broader view on security, only around open source. And the goal would be very similar to the rest of the spec, to say, we want you to be able to trust that we have reasonable processes in place, you know, around security with respect to that open source. And I think what we can try to do is start to draft what that might look like, keep it on the side, and then think about how it might be merged with the spec, or maybe added in like the community engagement requirement.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. Although I do have to say, I mean, for example, with license compliance, we found that actually OpenChain has provided us with a good framework to do license compliance in general, regardless of whether it is open source or whether it is proprietary or whether it is freeware. We follow a similar rigorous process. We say these are the steps that you need to do. You need to understand sort of the license. You need to understand what the obligations are, and you need to demonstrate that you can fulfill those obligations. So in a way, I think it worked really well, and I can see that you can apply the same principle to security vulnerabilities. I just feel that for many organizations, this is dealt with by different teams, and we need to sort of get that collaborative work and expertise with those teams. Help us define what would you expect to see in terms of managing security vulnerabilities. And yes, we can focus it on open source as a starting point, but I think you will find that that those processes and policies will probably can be scaled to apply to much wider than just open source. Certainly, that has been my experience with OpenChain from a license compliance perspective.
Yeah, and I agree with you too. We have similar experience where we apply to commercial third party, as well. And I think you touched on something that different teams might be doing the different work. That's okay too, because we're not really focused on how people structure their compliance even. Yeah,
Exactly.
That's right.
And we never want to be that prescriptive, right? That you have separate teams, or it must be the same team.
I think we're saying the same thing, and I agree with you. But as I said, I would like to make sure that when we define what is required to manage security vulnerabilities, I think we need to get wider input to define those components. And my personal preference is to get that done and then worry about where does it sit, where does it fit into OpenChain? Is it just a subsection? Is it an add-on? Is it I don't know, OpenChain security or whatever we choose to come at? But doing that groundwork first would be quite useful.
Okay, so think of it as treating it like a separate spec initially. I'm not saying we will in the end. But it's a separate spec, and we might merge it.
Perfect. I think it just gives us a better understanding where does it fit and how does it fit. Doing that groundwork first. So I think all of us are probably agreeing and say that work it would be great to have. Just let's look at it first and look and define what what components are needed, and then look at where does it fit.
Okay.
Regarding security, I'd like to put one thing out there, and of course I completely agree that security is usually handled differently, but OpenChain has one thing that is a little bit weird, I think, in this regard, and that is it looks at the underlying source. And we've seen this be actually an issue for some relating the software bill of material, as it is something that is, to be acquired, which isn't given. So the software bill of material, of course, needs to be generated. And it's basically one of the few parts where you have to consult upstream to a certain degree. And I think this is the interesting part that I would like to focus on regarding security. Because usually we think of security like look at CVEs or do code analysis, but rarely do people really look at the upstream packages themselves. And I think this is where openness is quite strong, to really look at the packages for business continuity or for just maintenance reasons. And this is actually something I see very rarely in security or any teams.
I'm sorry, what is rare?
That people actually look at the source code in any degree. So the meta information of the source. So where does it come from? Not really just connecting the CVEs, for instance, because this, and I completely agree here, can be done differently. And this is not unique to open source, but actually figuring out who is upstream, what is happening there.
Yeah.
This is something that is somewhat unique to open source. And this is what we see the challenge with. You even see this with licensing, where people sometimes can't even figure out where the license comes from or who is the author.
So I actually think that what really I see is the underlying core relationship to everything is the bill of materials, the open source bill of materials. And when I have that bill of materials, I think people will begin to look at the problem maybe a little differently. Even compliance started out with, no one was thinking about a bill of materials. They were just trying to scan code looking for licenses, right? And then we come to realize that if you say, hey, create a component list, right? And then systematically go through that list, you're going to probably have a much better experience and process. I think when it comes to security vulnerability, we're going to see similar things. The reason why I say that is sometimes 80, 90% of the software that's actually of the product is actually open source, right? So that means they are getting all their components from upstream. And if it's a lot easier for the community to keep eyeballs on these components and to report them back in a similar way we might even deal with licensing. So I think the key point I want to make here is that if you have a lot of times security vulnerability can be best managed by having a bill of materials. That might be proven wrong as we move forward, but it's my hypothesis at this point that bill of materials will be very productive to helping people manage all the complexity around security vulnerabilities with respect to the open source in their products. And for example, Heartbleed was the OpenSSL bug, right? Or the Apache struts. I don't know what they call that one. These were two core pieces of open source that had security vulnerabilities that impacted so many, right? And we were all able to ask, which version of OpenSSL do you have? And then you knew whether you had that vulnerability or not. And then once we were able to communicate that to our customers, we built a lot of trust in that regard. So I'm always thinking about how we can drive trust through our processes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I completely agree. And in case this was differently derived here differently, I completely like the idea of the security add-on. I just like to focus on the idea that the OpenChain standard is very well suited in actually acquiring meta information of the package or of the software, where security is one of those, and licensing, of course.
Yes, I agree. Okay, I think we're out of time. I thought that was really helpful to start that discussion. I'll try to summarize it in a few points. And I think what we'll try to do is put a side thread document up and see how that evolves. And again, the key point to understand here is there is no commitment for us to do this or to merge it with the spec. But at the end of this release cycle, we'll have a better understanding what our role should be with respect to security and potentially others. Okay?
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Have a great day.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.